Hey guys, imagine you're huddled in a timber-framed cottage at minus 30 degrees F, the wind howling like a disgruntled banshee, while the only glow comes from a low, acrid blaze that smells suspiciously of rotten eggs and fresh manure. Yeah, medieval peasants weren't lighting fresh pine logs. They were torching dried animal dung and peat because firewood was a luxury they couldn't afford. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love a good gross but genius history tidbit, and drop a comment telling us the strangest fuel you've ever used. And now, dim the lights, grab a warm drink or a sturdy nose plug, and let's step into the icy night where survival meant turning farm waste into stubborn heat, all while the neighbor's goat bleats louder than your Wi-Fi signal. The winter of 1323 settled over Brackenwick like a heavy quilt of frost. The wind sighing at minus 30 degrees F as it slipped through the cracked timber of the communal hall. Inside, peasants huddled on rough benches, their woolen cloaks pulled tight around shoulders that still bore the bite of the cold. Old Merk, the village elder, shuffled forward, the creak of his wooden sandals echoing softly against the stone floor. His breath formed pale clouds that lingered a moment before vanishing into the dim lantern light. He raised a weathered hand, signaling the start of a gathering that had been whispered about for generations. A murmur rose among the listeners as they recalled the previous harvest's failure, the fields having surrendered to a relentless frost that had turned stalks to brittle glass. The storage cellar, half filled with grain, trembled under the weight of frost-kissed sacks, each shiver of the building a reminder of shortage. Merk spoke of a forgotten rite, the burning of the last remaining stalks of wheat, not to warm the hall, but to shield the forthcoming planting from the same cruel cold. Hands, calloused and trembling, produced a bundle of golden stalks, their fibers still alive with the faint scent of summer. The peasants exchanged uneasy glances, the tension of hope tangled with the fear of loss. With a slow, deliberate motion, Merk lit the stalks, and a thin orange flame flickered, licking the dry husks in a quiet dance. The fire did not roar, it whispered, sending a thin plume of smoke upward, curling against the low beams, as if seeking the sky beyond the roof. The irony lay in the fact that the flame's heat was insufficient to thaw the ice that clung to the fields. Yet the villagers believed its smoke would carry a protective promise. As the ember glowed, a soft crackle punctuated the silence, and a few peasants smiled wearily, amused by the ritual that seemed both futile and essential. The hall filled with the faint scent of burning wheat, a reminder of the summer that once was. The blaze steadied, casting a gentle amber hue over the stone walls, while outside the wind continued its relentless howl against the shutters. People settled back onto their benches, the modest warmth seeping into chilled bones allowing conversations to drift like smoke, soft, measured, touching on chores and memories of past winters. Children, curled in thin blankets, listened to the crackle as if it were a lullaby, their eyes half closed against the dim light. Merck's voice, low and steady, described the cycles of sowing and reaping, each word as measured as the ticking of an ancient clock. The hall, now a sanctuary of muted sounds, held the village together in a still, collective breath. When the fire dwindled to a smoldering ember, the peasants gathered the spent stalks, their hands brushing ash that clung like a fine dust to the floorboards. They counted the remnants, noting that only a few blades survived, a modest tally that felt both a loss and a quiet triumph. In the hush that followed, Merck reflected on the ritual's meaning, seeing in the ash not just burnt wheat, but a reminder of resilience against a cold that would return each year. The village stepped out into the night, the wind still sharp, yet each footfall seemed steadier, as if the shared act had forged an invisible thread between them. Under the pale moon, Brackenwick lingered in a calm awareness that survival was a mosaic of small, ordinary gestures, each as enduring as the stone walls that had sheltered them. In the dim light of the hearth, Merck traced the outlines of his ancestors on a weathered linen map, pointing to the low fields that had fed his village for generations. He spoke of a season when a silent blight had kissed the wheat, turning the golden heads to a husk of ash. The cold outside pressed against the timber walls, a -30°F wind that rattled the shutters like an impatient visitor. Yet the villagers had not yet learned to surrender to the frost. They still harvested, feeling the grain slip through rough fingers. Their breath formed thin clouds that lingered over the courtyard, a reminder of the thin line between warmth and death. In his quiet tone, Merck began to explain why the people chose to burn something other than firewood. When the blight first appeared, the fields lay flat, their stalks drooping like weary heads after a long prayer. The peasants watched the soil turn a muted brown, hearing the faint crackle of frost as it crept across the furrows. Their stored grain, piled in rough wooden barrels, shivered under the icy draft that seeped through the cracks of the longhouse. Fear settled in the corners of the rooms, a silent weight that pressed against the backs of chairs where children slept. The community gathered around the communal fire, listening to the distant howl of wolves that seemed to echo the growing uncertainty. It was in this tension that a wandering monk arrived, his cloak dusted with snow, his face forever obscured by the shadows of his hood. The monk, whose name was lost to the ages, offered a strange counsel: to kindle the golden stalks at night, believing the rising smoke would carry their whispered hopes upward, sealing the earth against the relentless cold. He spoke in a low, measured voice, his hands turning the wheat bundles into small, controlled flames that sent thin ribbons of ash into the night sky. The peasants watched, the orange glow reflecting off their weathered faces, a hint of irony flickering in their eyes as they realized they were burning the very sustenance they feared to lose. Yet the smoke rose, curling like a lazy serpent, and the villagers felt a strange comfort in the ritual, a sense that something unseen might be listening. They set the fire each evening, the scent of burning grain mingling with the crisp, pine-scented air that seeped through the walls. The practice spread, becoming a quiet habit that marked the passage of each dark day. As winter deepened, the first heavy snowstorm arrived, its wind howling against the thatch, coating the world in a thick blanket of white. The stored grain, now half consumed by the nightly fires, shivered in its barrels, the cold seeping through the wood like a slow, patient breath. The villagers, wrapped in woolen cloaks, gathered near the still glowing embers, watching the smoke rise in slow, steady columns. The firelight painted the interior in warm terracotta hues, while outside the world remained a muted, frozen tableau. In that calm, the peasants whispered among themselves, questioning whether the sacrifice of their own food was a prudent trade for a promised protection. Yet the crackle of the fire persisted, a steady heartbeat against the storm's restless roar. When the snow finally melted and spring whispered through the thawing earth, the fields awoke with a modest green, a quiet testament to endurance. Merck reflected on the winter's ritual, noting how the villagers had learned to balance fear with hope, using the fire not merely as warmth, but as a bridge between loss and survival. The burned stalks left a faint, lingering scent that seemed to mingle with the fresh soil, a subtle reminder of the price paid for perseverance. Though the monks' teachings were now a fading legend, the practice lingered in the collective memory, a gentle reminder of humanity's capacity to find meaning in small, ordinary acts. The villagers harvested the new grain with reverent hands, feeling the texture of each grain as if it were a small, solid promise. In the quiet of the longhouse, the fire finally died, leaving only the soft glow of sunrise to fill the room, and Merck's voice faded like a tired sigh across the pages of history. The winter wind pressed against the thatch of the village cottages, painting the sky a dull slate as the thermometer sank to 30 degrees below zero. Inside each hall, the hearths lay cold, their stones dulled by months of soot and frost. The men dragged splintered logs from the forest, expecting the familiar crackle that once chased the chill away. Instead, the wood snapped with a brittle sigh, each piece surrendering heat before it could even catch. A thin veil of cold lingered, wrapping the low beams like a reluctant guest. By dusk, the villagers gathered around the failing fireplaces, their breath fogging the dim interior as they pressed their hands against the chilled iron pans. The men struck the logs again, listening for the hopeful pop that never arrived, while the women wrapped their shawls tighter around shoulders already numb. Whispers rose about the old practice of binding bundles of wheat, a rite spoken of in hushed tones when the frost grew too fierce for ordinary timber. Their leader, a weather-worn elder, stared at the grain stored in the loft, his eyes shadowed, the face of any priest behind him blurred by the dim light. The thought of burning the harvest seemed sacrilege, yet the cold pressed like a patient hand, demanding compromise. Just as the first bundle was being considered, a clatter of hooves echoed over the frozen lane, and soldiers bearing the seal of a distant lord emerged from the dusk. Their boots kicked up crusted snow as they marched toward the granary, eyes scanning for sacks of wheat that could feed their own men. The villagers watched, a mixture of resignation and thin amusement settling over them, as the soldiers seized the remaining sacks, their grip as firm as the iron hinges of the village gate. The absurdity of fighting over grain while the hearth sputtered was not lost on anyone. The cold seemed to laugh in a low, steady hum. With the wheat taken, the villagers retreated to the hearths, their shoulders dropping in a quiet acceptance of the night's bitter logic. Undeterred, a small group of women slipped back into the loft, retrieving a modest sheaf that had been hidden beneath a blanket of straw. They twisted the stalks into tight bundles, the dry husks rustling like paper in a still room, and carried them to the central hearth where the last ember glowed feebly. As the bundle caught, a soft amber flare rose, casting elongated shadows that danced across the stone walls, momentarily warming the air with a quiet glow. The crackle of the wheat was different, short, sharp, then steadier, offering a modest heat that filled the room with a faint, sweet scent of burnt grain. Around the fire, the villagers settled into their benches, eyes half closed, feeling the world slow to the rhythm of a modest flame. When the night waned and the first pale light of dawn brushed the horizon, the ember faded to gray, leaving behind a lingering warmth in the stone and in the villagers' memories. They rose slowly, their movements measured, each breath still carrying the faint taste of smoked wheat. In the quiet that followed, they repaired broken beams, tended to the frozen livestock, and stored what little grain remained for the next inevitable freeze. The episode lingered as a small testament to their adaptability, a reminder that survival often rests on the willingness to bend tradition without breaking it. As they worked, the village seemed to breathe a calm sigh. The cold outside no longer a tyrant, but a patient companion. The winter night lay heavy over the low thatched roofs, the air crisp enough to carve frost on the shutters. Villagers wrapped in wool shawls gathered beside the communal barn, each clutching a bundle of harvested wheat they'd set aside for the cold months. Their breath rose in thin clouds, disappearing into the -30°F darkness as the wind whispered through the bare fields. Against the shivering silence, the eldest farmer lifted a torch, his fingers trembling yet steady, and spoke of an old practice, burning the surplus stalks to protect the stored grain. A quiet agreement passed through the crowd, and the wheat was stacked in a neat pyramid, awaiting the midnight flame. When the church bell tolled 12, the first spark leapt from tinder to the dry stalks, sending a thin line of orange up the night. The wind, now howling like distant wolves, pressed against the flames, threatening to snuff them before they could rise. The Lord's men, cloaked in darker wool, stood at the fence, their eyes narrowed as they watched the peasants' desperate gesture. Each crackle of the burning wheat echoed against the stone walls, a reminder of both hope and the fragile state of the village's stores. Sweat mingled with the cold on the peasants' foreheads as they kept the fire fed, aware that any misstep could bring ruin. A quiet murmur rose among them, a mixture of prayer and practicality, as the blaze fought the frost. Soon the orange tongues licked the sky, and a slow plume of gray-blue smoke curled upward, veiling the moon in a soft shroud. To everyone's astonishment, the wind seemed to obey the fire, turning milder, as if the heat coaxed the cold into retreat. The lingering frost on the nearby granaries glittered less, the icy crystals melting under the invisible pressure of the rising steam. Lord's men exchanged glances, their stern faces breaking into faint, reluctant smiles, the irony of their own skepticism sinking into the ash. The peasants, though weary, allowed themselves a brief chuckle, the sound warm and low, as the flames performed the very protection they feared might destroy. Even the distant church bells seemed to pause, their reverberations softened by the thickening haze, as if the heavens themselves had taken a breath. When the fire settled into a steady amber glow, the village courtyard filled with a gentle warmth that brushed against chilled cheeks. Smoke drifted lazily toward the thatched roofs, its scent of scorched grain mixing with the cold pine air, a comforting reminder of harvests past. Villagers returned to their tasks. A mother mended a torn sleeve by the firelight. A child pressed a pinecone into his palm, and the blacksmith polished his tools in the soft radiance. The Lord's men lingered at the periphery, their boots still dusty, watching the scene with a quiet respect. The earlier tension now dissolved like mist. Even the wind, once a howling presence, now whispered through the trees, rustling leaves that glowed faintly in the fire's afterglow. The night deepened, yet the courtyard remained a pocket of steadiness, the flames having turned a moment of fear into an ordinary, enduring vigil. As the embers cooled, the villagers gathered the remaining wheat remains, tucking the charred stalks into the earth as a modest offering to the season. The Lord's men, now subdued, tipped their caps and slipped back to the manor, carrying with them the quiet lesson that simple acts can shape survival. In the hush that followed, the night sky stretched clear, stars blinking like distant witnesses to the village's unhurried resolve. Later, children would recount the midnight fire as a tale of communal hope, their voices soft, the memory blended with the scent of smoke and fresh bread. History would note the incident not for grand battles, but for the gentle reminder that humanity, even in frost, finds its own warmth through shared effort. And the hearth, now empty, held the lingering glow of an ordinary miracle, a calm testament to perseverance under the weight of winter. When the first frost of the year settled over the lowlands, the wind whispered through the half-broken thatch of the village huts, and the peasants gathered the last sheaves of wheat that had refused to sprout. The sky was a hard steel gray, and the air pressed against exposed skin with a chill that seemed to melt the breath of the workers. They lifted the golden stalks, feeling the dry husks brush their calloused hands, and carried them to the communal hearth as if escorting a reluctant guest. In the dim courtyard, the fire pit, long unused, waited like a hollowed stone, its iron ring cold to the touch. The decision to burn the unripe grain was spoken in low tones, a pragmatic exchange that rippled through the crowd like a quiet tide. Night fell with a silence that amplified the ache of shivering bodies, and the fire was coaxed to life by flint and stubborn hands. The flames crackled, throwing amber shadows across the faces of the villagers, whose eyes reflected both the heat and the dread of a winter that would not loosen its grip. As the wheat turned to ash, a thin plume of smoke rose, scented with burnt starch and the faint tang of frost-kissed soil. The villagers wrapped woolen shawls tighter, feeling the heat lapping at their arms like a hesitant lover, while the wind outside continued its relentless howl. The cold outside pressed against the walls, yet inside the hearth hummed a low, steady comfort that seemed to hold back the night. Morning light revealed a courtyard littered with the charred remnants of the harvest, a stark reminder of the sacrifice made for a fleeting warmth. Children, their cheeks pink from the fire's glow, wondered aloud why the very grain meant to feed them had been reduced to ash, their innocent questions echoing softly against stone. The elders, eyes half hidden by the brim of weather-worn caps, brushed the soot from their sleeves, offering a half smile that hinted at a quiet acceptance. The irony settled like the dust on the floorboards. The very thing that would have become bread now fed the hearth, keeping frost from gnawing at their doors. In that gentle paradox, the community sensed a strange balance, as if the earth itself had given a part of its bounty to shield its children from the deadliest cold. When the thaw arrived, the snow receded in slow, deliberate ribbons, exposing the dark soil that had once been cloaked in ice. The peasants stepped onto the softened ground, feeling the first tentative warmth seep through the soles of their boots, and the fields began to whisper promises of new growth. The burnt earth, now darkened, seemed to hold an extra heat, encouraging sprouts to push through with a vigor that surprised even the oldest hands. Around the rebuilt hearth, the villagers shared simple broth, their conversations a smooth current of gratitude and quiet laughter, as if the earlier sacrifice had woven an invisible thread of solidarity. The ritual of burning wheat, once a desperate act, became a protected rite, recorded in the village's ledger with a single line noting the year the winter was softened by harvested ash. Years later, the story of the burned wheat was recounted by the hearth's glow, each retelling a gentle reminder that survival sometimes demands a modest surrender. The survivors, now bearing the soft creases of age, ran their fingers over the cold stones, feeling the imprint of ash that once warmed their bones. They spoke of the lesson that the community's strength lay not in hoarding every grain, but in sharing heat, even if the source seemed unorthodox. The field's green canopy swayed above, casting dappled shadows that danced lazily across the courtyard, and the air carried a faint scent of earth and ember. In the calm of the evening, the villagers understood that the warmth that endured was less a product of fire than a testament to collective resolve. A quiet moral threading through the fabric of their days. In the year 1323, Brackenford lay tucked between frozen hedgerows, its thatch roofs heavy with snow that whispered against the wind. The mornings arrived gray, the breath of each villager painting thin clouds that vanished before the sun could linger. Harvest had ended weeks before, leaving only bundles of straw stacked like pale sentinels against the earth. Children shuffled through the quiet lanes, their boots leaving shallow prints that the frost quickly erased. The village seemed to hold its breath, awaiting a season that would test the patience of even the most stoic elders. By midwinter, the cold pressed against stone walls with a relentless insistence, and the hearths in the homes sputtered like weary insects. Tomas, the blacksmith, felt the iron grow brittle in his hands, the forge's fire dimming as the wind howled through the cracks of his workshop. Alara, his sister, tended to the sick with poultices that warmed only briefly, her fingers trembling as the candles flickered out. The grain stores were nearly empty, and the villagers gathered in the square, exchanging hushed words about the thinness of their provisions. A thin veil of desperation settled over the hamlet, though no one spoke of it aloud, preferring the sound of distant cattle over their own uneasy thoughts. One evening, as Tomas inspected a pile of straw bales abandoned after the harvest, a stray ember from his forge landed on a loose stalk, coaxing a small flame that licked the dry fibers. The fire caught quickly, producing a steady amber glow that seemed to push back the night more effectively than the usual kitchen hearth. Alara observed that the heat radiated from the burning straw warmed the shutters and the rough wooden beams, drying damp coats that had clung to the villagers' skins. They realized, with a muted chuckle, that the very refuse of their labor held a hidden utility, turning a symbol of waste into a source of comfort. The irony of finding warmth in what was meant to be discarded spread through the community like a quiet joke, softening the edge of their hardship. Soon, the villagers arranged the straw bales in modest rows beside their homes, each night lighting a modest fire that crackled without overwhelming smoke. Children gathered near the glow, their cheeks tinged pink, while Tomas hammered quietly, the rhythm of his hammer blending with the hush of the flames. Alara would sit on the threshold, stitching simple linens, her eyes occasionally drifting to the steady blaze, as if measuring the passage of time. The routine settled into a calm cadence, the village finding a new modest rhythm that blended work, warmth, and the occasional shared smile over a steaming mug of broth. Even the wind seemed to respect the soft hearths, its howl muffled by the gentle barrier of straw-fed fire. When spring finally coaxed the snow to melt, the straw bales were left as charred reminders of a winter survived through quiet ingenuity. Tomas and Alara walked the fields, noting the faint scent of ash that lingered in the air, a subtle testament to the season's perseverance. The villagers spoke little of the hardship, preferring instead to recall the soft glow that had steadied their nights, a memory that felt as warm as the lingering embers. In the years that followed, the story of the straw fire became a quiet lesson passed down, illustrating how ordinary materials could be transformed by patient hands. The frost-bound village, now bright with new growth, carried forward the calm patience that had once turned desperation into a gentle, enduring light. In the frost-cloaked valley, the village of Hartford huddles beneath a sky of muted gray. Alara, a weaver whose fingers are stained with wool, watches the breath of the wind turn to tiny clouds. she notices that beyond the hearth, the men and women pile straw bales and set them alight, a practice older than any record. The cold bites through woolen cloaks, and each exhale rolls like a soft drum on the frozen ground. A quiet curiosity stirs within her, wondering whether the flames serve a purpose beyond mere cooking. One night, she gathers a handful of dry straw, knots it into a loose bundle, and builds a modest fire beside the communal well. The smoke rises in thick ribbons, curling around the low stone walls and catching the pale moon. As the ember crackles, a shiver runs through the onlookers, some skeptical, some hopeful. The frost clings to the thatch, turning the air into a brittle canvas, and Alara feels a tension between tradition and experiment. She watches the blaze flicker, wondering if the effort will melt the stubborn chill. To her surprise, the smoke carries an acrid yet aromatic scent that seems to keep gnats at bay, while also settling on the racks of curing pork, extending their preservation. The pale columns rise against the white field, forming visible beacons that travelers can follow across the blanketed plains. There is a gentle irony in how a modest fire, intended for warmth, becomes a silent guardian against insects and loss. A wandering herder, lost in the storm, catches sight of the drifting plume and finds his way back to the village gate. The scene feels both ordinary and profound, as simple smoke fulfills multiple unseen duties. Soon the practice spreads, and each household stacks a straw bale near its doorway, the ember glowing amber as it steadies against the night. Children sit on cold stone steps, eyes tracking the flicker, while mothers tend to salted meat, the air tinged with resinous odor. The bitter cold recedes in pockets of warmth. The insects remain distant, and the visible smoke guides the few who wander beyond the fields. A quiet communal rhythm settles, the fire becoming a modest sentinel that watches over the village without fanfare. The earlier tension eases, replaced by a steady assurance that the simple blaze serves the people in more ways than any hearth ever could. Years later, the village scribe records that the aromatic plume saved a winter's share of meat and kept the meadow free of biting flies, noting the practice as a quiet triumph of observation. Alara, now older, walks past the stacked bales, feeling the faint warmth of memory rise like the lingering smoke. The community's resilience rests on such unassuming acts, a reminder that ingenuity often hides in the mundane. The storyteller reflects on the subtle interplay of necessity and chance, noting that even in sub-zero silence, a humble fire can speak. As night deepens, the steady smoke climbs toward the stars, and the world turns gently onward, cradled in a soft, enduring stillness. The winter wind pressed against the thatched roofs of the valley, frosting the narrow lanes where wooden carts creaked over ice. In the village square, bundles of straw lay stacked like pale hills, their dry husks waiting for the next use. Firewood reserves had dwindled after months of relentless cold, leaving the hearths to sigh in thin ember breaths. Mothers wrapped their children in wool, while men measured the depth of snow with measured steps, each footfall a quiet count of the season's weight. Even the cloistered monks watched from shadowed arches, their faces blurred by candlelight, noting the growing strain without a word. The council of elders convened beneath a low beam, their voices low as they debated the forbidden act of turning straw to flame. The parish priest, his beard a halo of frost, lifted a parchment and declared the practice heretical, his words echoing like distant bells across the courtyard. Yet the grain stores shivered, and the firewood piles were reduced to half their former height, leaving a gnawing chill in every hearth. With a hesitant hand, a carpenter struck a match against a stone, and the first straw bale hissed, crackling amber against the night. The scent of burning hay rose, mingling with the sharp bite of pine, while the villagers exchanged wary glances, aware that survival now tangled with belief. It was odd, almost comic, that the very smoke meant to save them would also conceal the scent of the stored grain from prowling wolves beyond the fence. As the flames licked the straw, a thin veil of gray rose, drifting low over the low walls, and the hungry eyes of the pack blurred in the haze. The hunters, uneasy with the sudden quiet, whispered that the fire itself was a sign, while the priest's hidden visage remained obscured by the flickering light. The villagers, cheeks reddened by the heat, laughed in low tones about the absurdity of burning what they had once used to bind roofs, as if the cold were a playwright demanding a strange script. In that moment, the irony settled like soot on the stone, softening the sharp edges of fear. Night fell deeper, and the communal fire steadied, casting a gentle amber glow over the wooden tables where women handed out broth in chipped bowls. The wolves, deterred by the lingering smoke, retreated to the forest, their distant howls muted by the steady crackle of the burning bales. Hands that had once measured firewood now passed bundles of straw to one another, each movement a quiet choreography of shared purpose. Children, their breath forming soft clouds, listened to the soft murmur of the elders recounting tales of past winters, their voices a low hum against the wind. The village settled into a rhythm, the cold outside becoming a background hum rather than a threat, and the once controversial flames steadied the heart of the community. When spring thaw finally softened the fields, the straw bales, blackened but intact, were gathered and woven anew into thatch, a reminder of the night they had lit the impossible. The priest, his shadow still indistinct in the morning light, offered a quiet nod, acknowledging that the line between doctrine and necessity can blur like smoke. Villagers recalled the cold as a teacher that had pressed them together. Each shared shiver a thread in the fabric of memory. The grain remained whole. The firewood reserves modest, but enough. And the wolves watched from afar, their silhouettes fading into the green hills. In the lingering silence of the rebuilt courtyard, the people felt a gentle gratitude for the humility the freeze had forced upon them, a calm acceptance of human frailty tempered by collective resolve. In late autumn, the thatched roofs of Brackenford sagged under a sky bruised with low clouds, while the villagers moved slowly through frozen lanes, their woolen cloaks brushing the snow-crusted cobbles. Tomas, a wiry carpenter with calloused hands, surveyed the field of straw bales that had been set aside for the winter's grain thrashing. He noted the wind's whisper as it curled around the wooden shutters, carrying a promise of the coming storm. The air held a sharp, biting chill that seemed to settle into the bones of every passerby. Though the village was accustomed to hardship, a collective stillness settled, as if the world were holding its breath before the inevitable. When the blizzard arrived, it arrived with a howl that rattled the shutters and sent snow lashing against the panes like relentless fists. The temperature fell below zero, and the river that bordered the village froze into a slick mirror that reflected the pale moon. Wolves prowled the edges of the whiteout, their silhouettes fleeting between gusts of ice-laden wind. Inside their homes, the hearths sputtered, offering only thin wisps of warmth that could not chase away the pervasive cold. Tomas felt the urgency rise. The straw bales, once idle, now seemed the only material capable of producing a heat strong enough to pierce the night. With deliberate slowness, Tomas gathered the villagers around the outskirts, where the bales lay like abandoned scrolls. They stacked them in a crude pyramid, each layer creaking under the weight of the next, while the wind sang through the straw, crackling like distant parchment. When the flames were finally kindled, they rose steadily, casting an orange glow that painted the snow in soft, trembling shades. The fire's heat rolled outward, melting patches of ice on the road, creating a path where hooves could tread without slipping. Ironically, the very straw that would have rotted in summer now became the village's winter beacon, a quiet reminder that survival often hinges on repurposing the mundane. As the blaze steadied, the wolves retreated, their silhouettes dissolving into the dimming horizon, dissuaded by the gentle yet insistent heat. Shepherds from neighboring hamlets, guided by the glow, found safe passage across the hardened river, their coats fluttering as they whispered thanks to the unseen faces of fate. The villagers, wrapped in blankets, lingered near the fire, feeling the warmth seep into their hands, and the quiet crackle ease the tension that had coiled in their chests. The night unfolded slowly, the smoke curling lazily above the rooftops, blending with the star-dotted sky in a muted tableau. In that stillness, the community sensed a shared pulse, a rhythm of endurance that rose and fell with each breath of flame. When dawn finally brushed the horizon with a pale amber, the fire was reduced to a bed of ash, its heat lingering in the softened snow. Tomas stood atop the remnants, his eyes tracing the faint outlines of melted pathways that would guide future journeys. The villagers dispersed back to their homes, carrying with them a quiet gratitude for the simple ingenuity that had turned straw into salvation. In the weeks that followed, the memory of the blaze settled into the village's collective consciousness like a gentle lullaby, reminding each generation that ordinary resources can become extraordinary when necessity whispers. Thus, the story of Brackenford's winter fire settled into the annals of history, a modest testament to human perseverance and the subtle humor of fate. When the first wind of winter slipped through the thatched roofs, the village awoke to a hush of breath on stone, and the faint rustle of straw bundles stacked against the cold walls. Women carried the dry stalks in woven baskets, their fingertips tingling as the frost kissed their knuckles, while the blacksmith's apprentice watched the pale sky turn a steely gray. The villagers had learned, long before any written record, that a small fire could stave off the bite of sub-zero night, and they arranged the bales in a shallow pit near the communal well. The scent of pine resin mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of iron as the first spark leapt, and a thin amber glow began to push back the gloom. Around the nascent flame, children pressed their faces to the heat, their cheeks flushing a rosy hue that contrasted with the surrounding ice. In that simple act, the cold was not merely endured, but met with a quiet, deliberate defiance. As the storm deepened, the wind grew louder, rattling shutters and scattering frost like powdered glass across the cobblestones. The fire, though steady, struggled against gusts that threatened to snuff its ember, and the village elder lifted a hand, feeling the tremor of trembling air on his palm. The villagers tightened their cloaks, their breath forming transient clouds that rose and vanished into the swirling blizzard, while the crackle of burning straw became a metronome of urgency. In those moments, the flame served a second purpose, a beacon that signaled to neighboring hamlets that the community remained alive. A thin column of smoke slicing through the gray veil. The sound of wooden beams expanding with heat echoed faintly, reminding each listener that survival hinged on both warmth and the subtle language of smoke signals. Tension lingered like the lingering chill. Yet the collective effort to keep the fire alive held a fragile, unspoken promise. When the gale finally eased, the villagers gathered the now charred remnants of the bale, arranging the ash in careful rows, as if laying out a ritual tapestry. A soft chuckle rose from the baker, who noted how the same flame that warmed their hands now served as a modest stage for gossip. The orange glow highlighting weary eyes that flickered with both amusement and resignation. The chief miller, wiping flour from his apron, remarked that the smoke had carried a stray message to the field beyond, a warning that the frost would linger longer than the harvest, an irony not lost on those who tended the grain. Children, now silent, traced their fingers over the warm stones, feeling the lingering heat seep into their fingertips, a reminder that the fire's purpose extended beyond mere sustenance. Even the shepherd, whose flock huddled nearby, smiled at the paradox of using straw, a material that would soon become feed to guard against cold. The ceremony, modest and unadorned, unfolded with a gentle humor that softened the sharp edge of hardship. With the clouds parting, the village entered a season of quiet celebration. The remnants of the burnt straw scattered like dark confetti across the courtyard. Families gathered around long wooden tables, sharing simple broth, while the lingering scent of smoldering straw mingled with the aroma of fresh rye bread. The elder raised a modest cup, his voice low, acknowledging the fire's dual role as protector and messenger, yet allowing the moment to settle into a steady rhythm of clinking mugs and soft murmurs. Lanterns swayed gently in the draught, casting amber circles on faces that bore the calm of those who had weathered the cold together. In the background, the blacksmith hammered rhythmically, each strike echoing the steady pulse of the hearth that still glowed faintly beneath the soot. The evening stretched languidly, a tableau of ordinary tasks stitched together by the shared memory of the ember's warmth. Years later, when new generations walked the same stone paths, they still paused before the cleared pit where straw once burned, tracing the faint outline with reverent curiosity. The practice had been woven into the calendar, marking the winter's midpoint with a quiet rite that reminded each villager of their collective resilience. Though the need for literal warmth had lessened, the symbolism persisted, a soft ember of identity that glowed in stories told by the firelight. Scholars from distant towns recorded the custom, noting how the villagers turned a pragmatic survival technique into a cultural legacy, a testament to human capacity to find meaning in routine. In the hush of twilight, the wind whispered through the empty fields, carrying the faint echo of past crackles, a gentle reminder that even the simplest acts can leave a lingering imprint on a community's heart. The villagers, now older, smiled at the subtle irony that their most practical habit had become a quiet monument to endurance and togetherness. In the deepening twilight of a 1349 winter, the village of Brackenridge lay under a blanket of frost that sang against stone walls and thatched roofs. The air carried the soft crunch of snow under boots, and the muted breath of shepherds returning from the fields. Brother Aldrich, a healer monk with a weather-worn cloak, arrived on a sled that left a thin line of tracks in the powder. He was guided to a small cellar where a hidden cache of animal fat glistened amber in the dim torchlight. The discovery felt like a quiet promise amid the relentless cold that had settled over the hamlet. The villagers gathered around the cellar doorway, their faces drawn and hands trembling from the bite of the wind. Mothers wrapped thin blankets tighter around children, while the blacksmith clanged his empty hammer against the iron door in a restless rhythm. Their eyes lingered on the greasy blocks, hoping for a source of heat that could stave off the night's hardening frost. Yet the fat lay still, unmoving, its surface slick with a faint, uninviting sheen. A sense of urgent need swirled through the crowd, like the cold drafts that slipped through the cracks of their homes. Aldrich, with a careful hand, tried to ignite the fat directly, but the flames sputtered and died, leaving only a whiff of oily smoke that curled upward like a bored sigh. The villagers watched the futile sparks with a mixture of disappointment and faint amusement, as if the very cold were sharing in their ironic plight. A child laughed, a brittle sound, at the sight of a tiny ember dying on a greasy lump, while the elder woman muttered about past winters when fire was a simple thing. The irony settled like a thin layer of snow on the scene, reminding everyone that even the obvious gift could be stubborn. Still, no heat rose, and the cold pressed nearer, patient and indifferent. After a measured pause, Aldrich set a shallow stone pan over a low ember and gently poured a thin stream of the animal fat, watching it melt with a quiet shimmer. The slow, steady glow that emerged was soft enough to warm the stone without stealing the breath of the room. Villagers leaned in, feeling the gentle rise of temperature against their chilled palms, as the faint scent of cooked meat mingled with the crisp winter air outside. The community began to gather, sharing simple broth and quiet conversation, the fire's glow reflecting in their weary eyes. In the steady light, the harshness of the night seemed to recede, replaced by a calm that settled like dust on old books. When the frost finally thinned under the steady heat, the people of Brackenridge kept the flame alive, preserving the lesson of patience and subtle ingenuity. Aldrich lingered by the hearth, his hands resting on the warm stone, observing the quiet rhythm of pots being stirred and blankets being adjusted. The village remembered the winter not for its cruelty, but for the soft humor of a greasy treasure turned to comfort. In the lingering glow, the memory of the cold became a gentle reminder of human resilience, an unspoken pact to listen to the small, steady sounds of survival. As the night deepened, a hush fell over Brackenridge, the fire crackling like a low, contented sigh. The wind rose like a pale curtain, sealing the hamlet of Brules into a white tomb as night fell. Snow piled against the low stone walls, muffling the usual clatter of carts and voices. Inside the central longhouse, Aldrich, a middle-aged cooper, stared at the dwindling flames while the shutters shivered. The villagers huddled on rough benches, their breath fogging the air, each wondering how long the cold would linger. Outside, the blizzard pressed on, oblivious to the human worry it wrapped in its relentless hush. Aldrich lifted a slab of raw animal fat, its pale sheen dulled by frost, and laid it upon the stone hearth, hoping its oils would coax the embers back to life. The fat hissed weakly, a faint sputter that smelled of stale marrow, yet the flame barely trembled before it waned. He turned the slab, brushed the ash with a rough hand, and whispered to the smoke as if coaxing a shy animal. The fire guttered, sending a thin plume of gray that dissolved into the cold, leaving the hearth cold as the winter night. A quiet murmur spread among the listeners, a mixture of disappointment and the strange patience that only long winters teach. An old woman from the rear, known for her quiet garden, stepped forward with a bundle of wiry leaves that smelled faintly of pine and earth. She crushed the leaves between her palms, sprinkling the green dust into the rendered fat that now rested in a shallow pan over a low ember. The mixture caught a sudden, steady blaze, the orange glow leaping higher than any of the villagers had expected from plain tallow. Aldrich watched, amused by the simple irony that a forgotten herb, not the fire itself, gave the fat its voice. The hearth warmed the room with a soft, steady heat, and the villagers felt the surprise of comfort settle like a gentle sigh. Warmth spread slowly across the stone floor, turning the chill into a mellow, almost tangible presence that the people could lean into. Children rested their heads on their mothers' laps, eyes half closed, while the men repaired cracked jars by the fading light. Aldrich, now calm, tended the fire with measured strokes, adding small pieces of rendered fat and the herb, each addition a quiet ritual. The blizzard outside continued its indifferent roar, but inside the longhouse, the air breathed a measured rhythm, like a heart finding its pace after a sudden shock. Time slipped by unnoticed, the only tick the soft crackle of the flame, and the occasional clink of a wooden spoon against a bowl. When the storm finally thinned, the villagers emerged with hands still warm, carrying the memory of a fire that had required more than brute heat. Aldrich reflected on how the secret herb, hidden among common weeds, reminded them that survival often rests on unnoticed details. The frost on the fields glittered like a distant promise, yet the village felt richer for the quiet lesson learned beneath the stone hearth. In the days that followed, the people kept a small pouch of the herb beside every hearth, a modest safeguard against future white wrath, and the tale of the first trial settled into the oral tapestry of Brules, told in low tones at night. A gentle reminder that even the coldest moments can yield a soft, steady glow. In the early winter of 1342, Aldrich, a modest monk of the northern priory, whispered to his apprentice the simple task of gathering the whispering herb, a low-lying plant said to release a faint scent when heated. The snow lay a thin veil over the pine woods, each branch bending under the weight of frost, while the monks' woolen cloaks brushed the ground with muted sighs. Elspeth, a hunter from the nearby village, arrived with a carved wooden staff, her eyes steady as the chill that pricked at her cheekbones. Their boots left shallow impressions in the snow, marking a tentative path toward the heart of the forest, where the herb was rumored to grow, beside a small, stone-capped spring. The cold was a quiet presence, a backdrop to the measured steps of two people seeking a modest warmth beyond the fire of their hearth. As they pushed deeper, the woods grew denser, and the wind began to howl through the firs, sending a chorus of pine needles rattling like distant shutters. A pack of wolves emerged from the shadows, their breath fogging the air as they circled, eyes glinting like damp coals. Elspeth steadied her bow, the wooden shaft creaking softly, while Aldrich clutched the modest satchel that held his thin parchment notes, his fingers numb yet steady. Suddenly, a rival monk, Brother Havel, appeared on a snow-capped ridge, his cloak darker than the dusk, his gaze fixed on the same patch of earth where the herb whispered beneath the frost. The tension hung thin as the frost on their lashes, each breath forming a fleeting cloud that dissolved into the night. In the fleeting pause, Brother Havel attempted to barter, offering a small barrel of tallow in exchange for the herb. His voice, a low murmur, barely rising above the crunch of snow beneath his boots. Aldrich, noting the irony of selling warmth for a plant that promised more heat, smiled faintly, the edges of his beard catching the pale light like stray ash. Elspeth, who had spent years hunting wolves, raised an eyebrow at the monk's desperation, the tip of her arrow quivering in the cold air as if waiting for a punchline. The wolves, sensing the change, retreated into the thicket, their snarls echoing like a distant drum, leaving the forest oddly quiet. The moment stretched, a thin thread of humor woven through the seriousness of survival. As the men and women stood amid the hush of the woods, the whispering herb barely visible beneath a crust of ice. With the herb finally uncovered, a cluster of green leaves trembling under a thin veil of frost, Aldrich knelt, his fingertips tingling as he brushed away the ice, feeling the faint, earthy scent rise like a soft exhale. Elsprie placed a small iron pan on a stone hearth they hastily assembled, the fire crackling low, the flames licking the metal with a gentle orange glow. The wolves, now distant, were heard only as a low, rhythmic howl, a reminder of the forest's ever-present breath. The rival monk stepped back, his eyes hidden behind the shadow of his hood, accepting the quiet loss of his ambition as the herb melted into the fire, releasing a faint steam that warmed their faces. The cold seemed to recede, not in a sudden thaw, but in a steady, patient softening, as the trio shared a modest bowl of broth flavored with the herb's subtle essence. Later, as twilight faded into a muted violet, Aldrich sat on a rough-hewn bench, his cloak draped over his legs, contemplating how a simple plant could temper both flesh and spirit. Elspeth traced the outline of a pinecone in the ash, her thoughts wandering to the wolves that had watched from the shadows, reminders of the fragile balance between hunter and hunted. Brother Havel, his face still unseen, lingered near the fire, the glow catching the edges of his worn sandals, perhaps pondering the quiet lesson that generosity can outlast ambition. The night air carried the lingering scent of the whispering herb, a faint perfume that mingled with the cold, making the world feel both larger and more intimate. In the soft hush, the forest seemed to breathe with them, a timeless witness to their modest triumph over the relentless frost. Snow lay thick over the low timber houses of Saint Marcel, muting the village sounds to a soft hiss of wind. In the communal outbuilding, Aldrich knelt beside a shallow iron pan, his hands steady as he melted the rendered fat of a dead goat, the amber liquid pooling with a faint, oily glow. Beside him, a bundle of dried sage and rosemary leaned, the herb's scent lingering like a promise of warmth. He mixed the fat with the crushed leaves, watching a thin violet flame emerge, brighter than the feeble hearths that struggled against the cold. The villagers gathered, their breath forming pale clouds that dissolved as the fire steadied, casting amber shadows on the stone floor. For the first night of the deep freeze, a modest ember held the frost at bay. The next morning, a monk from the distant abbey arrived, his robes dusted with frost, eyes narrowing at the unusual blaze. He claimed the fire violated the monastery's rule of plain sustenance, whispering that such contrivances invited divine displeasure. While the villagers cheered, the monk slipped a damp cloth into the fire, hoping the moisture would smother the flame. Instead, the cloth hissed, and a sudden plume of steam rose, momentarily obscuring the flame's steady glow. Aldrich felt the sudden chill on his skin, a subtle reminder that the fragile warmth could be easily undone. Tension crackled in the air, as quiet as the smoke that drifted through the low doorway. Yet the steam carried more than dampness. It lifted a thin veil that revealed the monk's trembling hands, the faint tremor betraying his hidden fear. The villagers, once amused by his solemn warnings, now watched the fire reclaim its heat, the vapor dispersing to expose the monk's concealed dagger, glinting dull under the ember's light. Irony settled like ash. The very act meant to extinguish the flame instead illuminated the treachery. Aldrich stepped forward, his breath warm, and placed a calm hand upon the monk's shoulder, the touch speaking louder than any sermon. The fire, unperturbed, crackled on, steady as an indifferent witness. The monk lowered his weapon, the metal clinking against the iron pan, and withdrew into the shadows of the outbuilding, his silhouette merging with the dim corners. Aldrich tended the fire, adding a few more sprigs of herb, each scent weaving into the smoke that now rose in lazy spirals toward the thatched roof. Villagers resumed their work, mending woolen cloaks, sharing a chipped wooden bowl of porridge, while the ember flickered like a patient pulse. The heat seeped into stone walls, softening the frost that clung to the window panes, turning sharp edges into a gentle sheen. In the quiet, the crackle of the flame became a metronome for the night, marking time without hurry. The village settled into a rhythm as steady as the fire itself. When dawn finally painted the sky with pale rose, the fire had dwindled to a low glow. Yet its warmth lingered in the villagers' bones. Aldrich stood at the doorway, watching the frost melt away, noting how a simple mixture of animal fat and herb had steadied a community through hardship. He thought of the monk's failed sabotage, realizing that ambition often burns brighter when exposed to honest heat. The quiet that followed felt less like triumph than an invitation to remember the fragility of comfort and the modest ingenuity that sustains it. In that lingering hush, the village learned that hope, like an ember, need not roar to outlast the cold. The first frost of the season settled over Brackenridge like a thin veil of paper, muffling the clatter of wooden carts and the low murmur of hearths. Aldrich, the village scribe, watched the pale sunrise spill over the thatched roofs, noting how the wind scraped icy patterns across the panes. In the communal barn, old men and women gathered the remnants of the winter hunt, trimming the sinewy strips of deer and bore fat with careful knives. A younger shepherd named Cormac whispered about an old alpine tale that suggested the greasy material could feed a fire when rendered and poured onto kindling. The group exchanged glances, the air thick with the scent of cold metal and animal oil, as they prepared to test a method that might change their nights. The night grew darker than any the villagers remembered, and the first attempts at lighting the fat-soaked tinder sputtered in the bitter wind. Smoke rose in thin, cold ribbons, painting the sky with a ghostly gray that seemed to swallow the feeble flames. Hands grew numb as they struck flint, only to see the wick of the fire die almost as soon as it sparked, leaving a lingering chill in the stone walls. Aldrich recorded each failure in his vellum, his quill shaking as the frost crept into his sleeves, and the villagers' faces, half-shadowed, revealed the slow rise of weariness, the sense of looming hunger pressed against the shutters. A silent reminder that the season would not wait for a misfire. Just as hope seemed to thin like the smoke, a clumsy apprentice knocked a pot of rendered fat onto the hearth, spilling a puddle that hissed and glowed brighter than any torch they had known. The fire licked the sudden pool, sending up a brief orange flare that illuminated the startled eyes of the villagers, who stared as the room filled with a gentle, steady heat. Laughter, low and surprised, slipped through the cold, as the elder women remarked that perhaps the gods of warmth were less mysterious than the stubbornness of men. The irony of a careless spill becoming their salvation was noted by Aldrich, who doodled a tiny droplet beside his meticulous script. The night, once a hard, unyielding wall, softened into a modest amber glow that crackled with the simple sound of oil-feeding flame. From that evening onward, the hearths of Brackenridge glowed with a quiet constancy, each household learning to shave thin ribbons of fat and melt them slowly before adding them to the kindling. The villagers fell into a measured rhythm. The night watchman would sweep the soot, while children whispered stories of the unexpected fire, and the women kneaded dough beside the warm stone, their fingers feeling the steady heat radiating through their shawls. The cold seeped less into the walls, and the wind outside seemed a distant murmur, as if the season itself were holding its breath. Aldrich continued to note the process in his codex, the ink drying without the bite of winter's chill, and the village council agreed to store surplus fat in sealed clay jars for future winters. In the soft amber light, the community moved with a lull, each gesture deliberate, each breath warmed by the steady flame. As spring threatened to melt the remaining ice, Aldrich sealed the vellum codex, his leather cover stained with a faint amber hue from the fat rendering experiments. He inked a final margin, a brief observation that the secret lay not only in the animal's flesh, but in the willingness to let a mistake become method, a lesson he hoped would outlast his own frail hands. The codex was placed on a low shelf in the communal hall, where future generations could lift it by lamplight, feeling the smooth grain of the pages between their fingertips. The villagers, now accustomed to the warmth, stood at the doorway watching the snow recede, the faint smell of smoke lingering like a quiet promise. In the quiet that followed, the village seemed to breathe as a single organism, its memory of frost softened by the steady glow that would, for generations, keep the darkness at bay. In the valley of Eldermore, the thatched roof of Tomas and Lyra's hut shivered under a sky bruised with early winter gray. The wooden beams, dark with age, held a thin layer of straw that whispered each time the wind slipped through the cracks. Tomas swept the floor with a worn broom, his breath forming faint clouds that rose like quiet questions. Lyra, seated by the hearth, traced the soot-covered stones with a fingertip, noting how the fire's heat clung reluctantly to the walls. Outside, the forest stood silent, its ferns bending under the weight of the first chill. When the first bitter wind gusted through the doorway, it carried a sharp bite that pressed against the children's cheeks and tugged at the thin curtains. The hearth sputtered, sending a sudden flare that illuminated the cramped room for a breath before dimming to a reluctant glow. Tomas felt the wooden floorboards creak as the cold seeped beneath his boots, and Lyra tightened the woolen shawl around her shoulders, the fabric rough against her skin. Their mother's voice, thin with fatigue, warned that the night would be long if the walls could not hold the warmth. In the corner, an old chest cracked open, revealing half-spent bundles of dried firewood that seemed insufficient for the looming darkness. The siblings exchanged a glance that held both hope and the unspoken fear of another frozen night. Merk, the village elder, shuffled in with a cane that clicked against the stone floor, his eyes scanning the trembling flames as if reading a story they had all forgotten. He spoke of a technique long ago abandoned: charred bracken, the blackened fronds of ferns that once lined the forest floor, used as a thin, insulating layer between wall and thatch. The notion seemed absurd to Tomas, who imagined the scent of burnt plant matter mingling with the smoke. Yet Merk's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had felt the bracken's warmth against his own back during harsher winters. He recounted how the villagers would collect the ferns before the snow sealed the woods, scorch them over slow embers, and press the charcoal-gray leaves into the gaps of the walls. The irony lay in the simplicity of the solution, forgotten while the valley's people grew accustomed to more elaborate, yet less effective, methods. A quiet chuckle escaped Lyra as she imagined the whole village crouching over a pile of blackened foliage, a scene both humble and oddly dignified. The trio set out before the sun sank behind the hills, their breaths forming clouds that rose and vanished in the crisp air. Tomas and Lyra knelt among the bracken, their fingers brushing the feathery fronds that shivered with frost as they gathered handfuls with careful urgency. Merk tended a modest fire, its ember glow turning the green leaves to deep charcoal, the crackle of burning bracken echoing faintly through the trees. After the ferns were charred, they carried the brittle sheets back to the hut, sliding them between the thatch and the timber, the texture rough, yet promising a modest seal against the wind. The night grew colder, but the interior retained a steadier heat, the charred layers absorbing and releasing warmth like a muted drumbeat. As they settled down, the house seemed to settle with them, the walls humming a low, steady comfort that steadied their thoughts. When spring finally coaxed the snow to melt, the hut stood a little sturdier, its walls bearing the faint, dark pattern of the bracken that had shielded its occupants. Tomas, now older, traced the charred seams with a respectful hand, remembering how a forgotten practice had turned the bitter frost into a lesson about listening to the land. Lyra, her hair now streaked with gray, smiled at the memory of the soot-stained faces around the hearth, finding humor in the modest triumph of simple ingenuity. Merk, whose steps had become slower, rested his cane against the doorway, eyes reflecting a quiet pride that no grand monuments could match. The valley resumed its rhythm, the ferns sprouting anew each year, waiting to be remembered once more when another harsh winter tested the patience of humble hands. When the first frost of the season settled over the low hills, Tomas and Lyra stood at the edge of the village with a handful of worn gloves and a shared sense of purpose. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and each breath formed a thin veil that clung to their coats. Village elders had spoken of the black fern that grew wild near the river, its tall stalks promising a modest shield against the coming cold. The two friends exchanged a quiet nod, aware that the task would be as much about endurance as about gathering. Behind them, muted chatter rose from the cottages, a reminder that life would continue regardless of the chill. They trekked through the skeletal forest, the rustle of bracken leaves underfoot punctuated by the occasional snap of brittle twigs. The wind grew sharper, tugging at their scarves and sending shivers through the thin wool that covered their skin. Tomas lifted a stalk, its dark veins stark against the pale bark, and felt its weight lighter than the frost-laden stones they had left behind. Lyra struck a flint, coaxing a small flame that danced on the damp ground, inviting the bracken to meet fire. The first attempts at scorching were clumsy, smoke curling lazily before being swallowed by the cold air. Yet each ember whispered of an unseen warmth. Their hands, now stained with soot, trembled not from fear, but from the quiet intensity of the work. When the bracken finally surrendered to the flame, it transformed into a charcoal like shavings that crackled softly, releasing a faint, earthy scent. The villagers laughed, not loudly, but with a weary smile, recognizing the irony of turning dead fronds into a fragile blanket of heat. The material, feather light in their palm, seemed too insubstantial to fend off winter's bite. Yet the heat it retained lingered longer than expected. Tomas pressed a handful against his cheek, feeling a gentle warmth that contrasted sharply with the frozen wind swirling beyond the trees. Lyra carefully packed the material into burlap sacks, each one a modest promise of comfort for the night. Their collective effort, simple and unpretentious, revealed how small acts could outshine grand gestures in the face of hardship. As night fell, a sudden storm rolled over the hills, driving rain and snow into relentless sheets that obscured the path home. The villagers hurried to the nearest hut, sliding the charred bracken onto the interior walls with practiced ease. The hushed crackle of the fire inside rose, and the once cold air inside the shelter softened, holding a steady, low heat that seemed to breathe with the storm outside. The walls, now lined with the black fern's remains, did not sag under the weight of the tempest. They stood resilient, a quiet testament to the material's hidden strength. In the flickering lamplight, faces appeared tired yet content, their eyes reflecting the subdued glow of the hearth. When daylight returned, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thin crust of frost that glittered like distant stars on the village rooftops. Tomas and Lyra emerged from the hut, their steps lighter, their breath steadier, the charred bracken still humming faint warmth within the walls. The villagers gathered, sharing modest meals, while the huts retained a gentle heat that prolonged the evening without an extra fire. In the quiet that settled over the gathered crowd, a subtle understanding formed. The simplest resources, when tended with care, could cradle a community through the harshest of seasons. The story of the black fern became a quiet refrain, spoken not with grand proclamations, but with the soft rustle of pages in a weathered ledger, a reminder that endurance often lies in the modest and the unassuming. In the waning light of early winter, the village gathered around Merck's modest cottage, the low thrum of murmuring wind threading through the skeletal wattle walls. He lifted a bundle of dry bracken, its fronds blackened by the recent hearth fire, and explained in steady tones how the charred stalks could be slipped between the woven lattice and the earthy daub. The peasants watched his hands, as he spread the soot-kissed material, the scent of ash mingling with the cold pine that lingered in the air. Children shuffled forward, their woolen sleeves brushing the frost-glazed ground, while the older women pressed their palms to the rough timber, feeling the contrast of heat and chill. A tentative optimism settled over the crowd, as the simple idea promised a modest shield against the night's bite. Yet the elders, faces furrowed like the furrows of the nearby fields, raised cautious eyebrows, questioning whether such a humble substitute could truly stave off the deepening cold. Their voices rose in low, measured protest, recalling winters past when only thick blankets and shared hearths survived the freeze. Merk listened, the wind rattling the loose thatch above, aware that the days to prepare were vanishing like breath on glass. He counted the hours left before the first frost hardened the ground, the ticking of a wooden clock hidden in the hall. The tension lingered like a thin veil, as each hand hesitated between tradition and necessity. Irony crept in as the charred bracken, once a discarded byproduct of the communal fire, now became the village's unexpected savior. When a skeptical elder touched the freshly laid layers, a faint warmth radiated upward, subtle as a whispered secret, and the scent of burnt foliage turned from acrid to comforting. Laughter, quiet and weary, escaped from a few shoulders, not out of mockery, but relief at the surprising comfort. The huts, still skeletal, seemed to inhale the gentle heat, their walls gently expanding with the hidden ember. In that moment, the simple act of repurposing waste felt like a quiet joke played by the seasons themselves. By nightfall, the first insulated hut glowed with a steady amber light that seeped through the cracks, casting soft shadows on the packed earth floor. Inside, families huddled on rough-hewn benches, the heat touching their backs like a familiar hand, while the wind outside hissed against the bracken-lined walls. The crackle of the fire inside blended with the muffled rustle of the bracken, creating a lullaby of heat and sound. Even the youngest child, eyes half closed, rested a hand on the warm plaster, feeling the subtle pulse of the night's defense. The scene settled into a quiet rhythm, each breath synchronized with the slow, comforting rise of the hearth. In the days that followed, the villagers moved through their chores with a softer step, the memory of the charred bracken's warmth lingering like a quiet promise. Merk would often be seen watching the smoke curl upward, his gaze steady, reflecting on how necessity reshaped their traditions without breaking them. The huts, now modestly fortified, stood as humble testaments to a collective willingness to adapt, their walls bearing the faint imprint of soot as a silent chronicle. As the winter waned, the village carried forward a subtle humility, aware that even the simplest materials could cradle life when placed with care. History, in its patient way, smiled at the modest triumph, noting how a handful of blackened fronds turned a harsh season into a lesson of quiet endurance. In the low valley, where the river snaked between bare hills, Tomas and his kin harvested the spindly fronds of bracken each autumn, letting the fire's ember turn the tips to a quiet, dark gray. The charred stalks, once brittle, softened under the weight of winter rain, and the peasants layered them against the wooden frames of their huts as a rough, insulating panel. They pressed the material with rough hands, feeling the faint warmth that lingered from the smoldering embers, and tied the strips with twine that smelled of pine sap. The houses grew modestly taller, their walls a patchwork of earth, wattle, and the new blackened bracken, as if the landscape itself had been stitched together. At night, the families gathered around a low hearth, watching the fire's orange flicker against the darkened walls, while a soft wind whispered through the cracks, hinting at the season to come. When January's first storm surged from the north, the valley fell under a relentless white curtain that hissed against the eaves of every dwelling. Snow slammed into the thatch, shoving itself into every crevice, while the wind howled like a distant animal, shaking the loose panels of the huts. Tomas felt the cold seep through the gaps in his neighbors' homes, seeing thin streams of breath escape from cracked windows as families huddled in thin blankets. The bracken walls of his own hut, however, thudded with a muted firmness, the charred fibers absorbing the shock as if they were bone. The storm's fury seemed to test each structure, measuring the difference between the familiar, untested methods and the newly forged insulation. As the blizzard reached its crescendo, several nearby huts collapsed under the weight of ice that turned their roofs into brittle plates. The sound of splintering wood echoed over the howling gale, a dark punctuation to the night. Yet Tomas's home stood, the bracken panels humming softly against the wind, their blackened surfaces darkening the interior, keeping the cold at bay. Neighbors peered through the drifting snow, their faces blurred by the wind-driven light, and wondered why the same storm that had shattered other walls left this one untouched. The irony settled like a settled snowdrift. A simple, almost careless experiment in using burned foliage now became the valley's quiet salvation. Tomas's wife, Mara, offered a small cup of tea to a shivering neighbor, the steam mingling with the frosty air, a modest gesture that highlighted the contrast between fragility and resilience. When the wind finally relented, the valley lay in a hushed white, broken only by the soft creak of settling timber and the occasional sigh of the river beneath the ice. Villagers gathered in the central square, their breath forming brief clouds as they examined the remnants of the ruined huts and the intact bracken walls. Tomas demonstrated how the charred stalks could be quickly assembled, sliding them together like sturdy cards, while the children watched with sleepy eyes, their cheeks pink from the cold. The community, wearied yet steady, agreed to replicate the method, distributing the blackened bracken to every family with a calm efficiency that seemed rehearsed by generations of hardship. In the evening glow, lanterns flickered against the snow-covered roofs, casting a gentle amber light over faces that were relieved, thoughtful, and quietly amused by their own ingenuity. Months later, when spring coaxed the first green shoots from the thawing earth, the valley's houses bore the soft scars of the blizzard, yet stood firm, their bracken skin darkened by time and sun. Tomas walked the lane, feeling the coolness of the newly sprouted grass beneath his boots, recalling how a simple act of burning the common fern had altered the fate of many. The villagers, now accustomed to the quiet strength of the charred panels, spoke of the storm as a lesson in humility, noting that the smallest adaptation could shift the balance between survival and loss. Their stories, told over modest meals, carried a gentle humor about how a fire meant for hearth could become a shield, an irony that lingered like the faint scent of smoke in the air. In the calm evenings, the valley rested, its people aware that history often moves as slowly as the turning of a pinecone, and that their quiet persistence would be the lasting warmth for generations to come. The first frost settled across the valley, sending a thin hiss over the thatched roofs as wind slipped through cracked panes. Tomas, his hands raw from chopping wood, noticed a patch of bracken that had survived a stray spark from the hearth. Its fronds blackened, yet still stiff. The charred stalks gave off a faint, smoky warmth when pressed, a subtle contrast to the biting air. Curious, he gathered the brittle ferns, laying them beside the fire to gauge any lingering heat. The village watched in quiet expectation as the simple experiment began. By midwinter, the valley groaned under a relentless gale, the night air turning the interior of huts into icy chambers where breath fogged the low beams. Families huddled over meager meals, the clatter of wooden spoons echoing in the dim light, while children shivered under rough blankets. The usual stock of straw and peat proved insufficient as the cold seeped through every crack, making the floorboards bite cold into bare feet. Tomas felt the weight of responsibility settle like snow on his shoulders, each muffled sigh from the hearth a reminder of dwindling warmth. He returned to the charred bracken, arranging it in the walls like a reluctant soldier. The moment the first layer touched the interior, a faint, steady heat seemed to pulse from the dark fibers. It was an odd sight, blackened ferns, once dry and brittle, now hugging the wooden walls like a shy ember. The villagers whispered, half amused, half bewildered, as the hearth's flames danced and the bracken glowed a muted amber without flame. Lyra, the keeper of stories, recorded the oddity in the communal log, noting how the fire's ash had turned the fern into a quiet insulator. The irony was not lost on anyone. The very thing that had been consumed by fire now held back its chill. As the night deepened, the hut retained a gentle warmth that made the cold outside feel distant, and the simple remedy spread a silent smile among the weary faces. When spring's thaw whispered through the valley, the tale of the charred bracken traveled on footpaths to neighboring hamlets, carried by traders and wandering shepherds. Tomas refined the layering technique, binding the black ferns with twine and placing them between wattle panels, while Lyra taught children the rhythm of gathering and preserving the fern before the next blaze. The valley's homes grew sturdier, each winter echoing the same quiet confidence that the humble fern would stand guard against frost. Even the elders, whose faces were shadowed by time, nodded approvingly, their eyes reflecting a soft amusement at humanity's modest ingenuity. The tradition settled into the rhythm of the seasons, a calm ritual that required little more than a spark and a handful of bracken. Life moved forward, the cold winters no longer a relentless adversary, but a predictable companion. Years later, when the valley's children grew into parents, the charred bracken remained a modest hallmark of their heritage, spoken of in low tones over steaming cups of broth. Tomas, now gray-haired, watched new builders repeat his method, feeling a gentle pride that lingered like the afterglow of a hearth. Lyra, her ledger full of verses, would occasionally trace the faded ink, remembering how a stray ember had sparked an enduring comfort. The valley thrived each winter, its huts breathing a soft heat that seemed to honor the silent resilience of a simple fern. In the stillness of another night, the wind whispered through the cracks, and the story rested, content, as if history itself were settling down to sleep. In the waning light of early evening, the village of Frosthelo lay silent beneath a sky bruised with pale gray, the air tasting of frozen pine and iron. Blacksmith Ealdred leaned against the stone wall of his forge, his hands still chilled despite the soot-black apron that covered his forearms, while healer Myra shuffled across the frost-crusted courtyard, her wool-trimmed cloak brushing the snow-kissed stones. The wind whispered through the narrow lanes, rattling shutters, and carrying the faint sigh of a river, half frozen beneath a thin veil of ice. Their hearths, long-standing companions against the night, now exhaled thin, uneven plumes that seemed more like sighs than flames. Together they surveyed the village, feeling the weight of a cold that had settled like a blanket, patient and relentless. As the night deepened, the fire in Ealdred's forge flickered, its ember glow paling against the encroaching darkness, and the wooden beams of his shop creaked with each draught that slipped through the cracks. Myra's own household hearth clanged with the occasional pop of damp wood, sending thin sparks that sputtered before dying on the cold stone floor. Their breath formed fleeting clouds that vanished into the night, each exhale a reminder of the thin line between warmth and frost. Villagers passed by, shoulders hunched, eyes glazed with a weariness that matched the frozen river that ran beside their homes. The sense of urgency grew, not in shouts, but in the quiet determination to coax a stubborn flame to stay alive. An elder, whose beard was as white as the surrounding snow, approached the two with measured steps, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the hard-packed snow, and spoke of a practice long forgotten by the younger hands. He described how, in generations past, dried manure collected from the barns was carefully stacked and set alight, its slow, steady burn providing a hidden heat that seeped through walls and floorboards. The notion seemed absurd to Ealdred, whose life had been measured in the clang of hammer and the glow of metal. Yet the elder's eyes held a steadiness that hinted at hidden wisdom. Myra listened, noting the faint scent of earth in the elder's words, a reminder of the soil that fed the village's very existence. A quiet irony settled over the trio, a blend of practicality and tradition that felt both familiar and strangely out of place in the harsh, white night. Together they gathered the dried piles, their fingers numb as they lifted the brittle bundles, and arranged them in the corner of the forge, allowing the dry tinder to catch the lingering embers. The fire rose slowly, first as a timid orange, then swelling into a warm amber that brushed the stone walls with a gentle heat, coaxing the cold out of the cracks. As the furnace steadied, a soft crackle filled the workshop, harmonizing with the distant howl of wind, creating a low lullaby of survival. Ealdred wiped the sweat that surprised him with its warmth from his brow, and Myra smiled faintly, the lines on her face softening under the new glow. The village seemed to breathe a little easier, the frost receding from doorways, not by grand miracle, but by the modest, earthy flame that had once fed cattle and now fed hearths. When dawn finally painted the sky with a wash of pale amber, the villagers emerged from their homes, their steps lighter, their cheeks still flushed from the lingering heat. Ealdred and Myra stood side by side, watching the thawed river sparkle as if in quiet gratitude, recognizing that the night's hardship had been met not with grand heroics, but with the simple, humble knowledge of their ancestors. The elder, now a silent silhouette against the weakening frost, faded back into the crowd, his presence a reminder that the greatest comforts often arise from the most unassuming sources. In the calm after the fire burned steady, the village reflected on its own resilience, the subtle humor of turning manure into warmth, whispering through generations. Their story settled into memory like ash on a stone floor, quiet, enduring, and gently amusing in its ordinary perseverance. In the waning light of a November evening, Ealdred and Myra slipped their boots into the shallow, ice-crusted river that ran like a pale ribbon through the valley. The air hung at -20 degrees, each breath a thin cloud that vanished before it could settle. Their fingers clutched a frayed map, its ink faded by countless winters, pointing toward a ruin hidden among snow-laden pines. With each step, they left a soft imprint in the fresh drift, the only sound the distant rustle of pine needles, the promise of a weather-worn scroll, said to hold the secret of heating with dried dung, nudged their resolve forward like a quiet ember in the gloom. Soon the forest grew denser, and the low murmur of wolves echoed through the firs, a reminder that the night guarded its own mysteries. A sudden gust sent shivers through Myra's woolen cloak, and Ealdred's hands trembled as they tightened their grip on the crude, wooden staff he carried for balance. The path narrowed to a cracked stone archway, beyond which the crumbling monastery rose, its broken arches silhouetted against a sky bruised with freezing stars. Inside, the floor was littered with fallen stones, each crunching underfoot, while a stale draught whispered through the void, carrying the scent of old incense and damp stone. Their hearts beat in sync with the wind, aware that any misstep could lead to a fall, a bite, or a night spent shivering beneath the ruins. When they finally uncovered the scroll beneath a slab of moss-clad stone, the parchment cracked like dry bark, revealing a simple diagram of stacked bundles of dried manure, ready for a hearth. The irony was palpable. The very substance that fed cattle and fertilized fields was now presented as a modest source of warmth for weary travelers. Ealdred's brow lifted in a half-smile, noting how the monks had once dismissed the practice as too humble for holy chambers. Yet here it lay, a pragmatic answer to the bitter cold. Myra traced the inked arrows with a finger, feeling the rough texture of the fibers that would soon be gathered from the nearby pasture. The silence that settled over them felt less like reverence and more like a whispered acknowledgement of human ingenuity hidden in the mundane. Back in the clearing, they gathered bundles of the dried dung, the dry husks cracking softly as they were stacked upon a low stone hearth. The flame caught reluctantly at first, a wavering orange that grew steadier as the bundles charred, releasing a faint, smoky scent that blended with the pine-laden air. Warmth seeped into their palms, coaxing back a feeling of comfort that had been absent since their crossing of the icy river. Around them, the snow began to melt in small circles, the cold retreating like a tide pulled back by a gentle hand. As they rested, the crackle of fire kept time with their breathing, a steady rhythm that matched the slow drift of clouds across the night sky. When the fire faded to a soft amber glow, Ealdred and Myra sat side by side, their eyes gazing at the stars that now seemed less distant behind the veil of a clearer sky. The night, once a hostile expanse, had become a quiet companion, reminding them that survival often rests on the unremarkable choices of everyday life. They reflected on how a bundle of humble manure could outlast the grandest tapestries in providing solace against winter's bite. The monk's forgotten scroll lingered in their thoughts, a reminder that knowledge, even when buried beneath stone and snow, can surface when necessity whispers. With the last ember sputtering, they rose quietly, their footsteps leaving faint imprints in the softened snow, carrying forward the subtle lesson that humanity's greatest comforts may emerge from its simplest, most overlooked resources. In the waning light of a February evening, the thatched cottages of Frosthlow huddled together against a -20°F wind that rattled shutters and whispered through the pine lanes. Two brothers, Ilan and Mare, had collected the season's dried manure, stacking the pale bundles in the communal yard as a hopeful substitute for scarce firewood. Their hands, raw from cold, brushed the rough shafts, while the low sky turned a muted indigo, and the scent of earth rose faintly in the frosty air. They arranged the piles in a shallow pit, the stone rim still damp from the day's thaw, and leaned over with a flint, eyes fixed on the darkened center. The village watched in quiet anticipation, breath forming brief clouds that vanished as quickly as the promise of warmth. The moment seemed poised between patience and necessity, the first ember of a night that might have been merely endured. When the flint struck, the tinder hissed only a faint sputter, and the dry manure stayed stubbornly dark, refusing the kiss of flame. A murmuring ripple passed through the gathered villagers, some turning their faces toward the east where an old willow creaked, others glancing at the shadowed edge of the woods where rumors of a witch lingered. Elder Brahm, his lined face blurred by the dim lantern light, suggested that a curse might have settled upon their hearth, his voice low enough to blend with the wind. Fear threaded through the crowd, dividing hands that once shared bread into those who clutched prayer-shaped stones, and those who pressed their palms against the cold stone of the pit. Children shivered, cheeks flushed from the bite of the night, while the brothers swapped uneasy glances, feeling the weight of expectation settle like frost on a window pane. The silence that followed was not empty, but thick with unspoken doubts, each breath a small protest against the stubborn darkness. Amid the uneasy stillness, Mara, the village's seamstress, lifted a single piece of dried straw from the side, its brittle tip glittering with a thin veil of frost, and tossed it lightly toward the pile. A stray gust from the north slipped through the gap in the fence, catching the straw just enough to coax a reluctant spark that fluttered like a moth before settling into a timid flame. The fire crackled softly, orange tongues licking the manure, and the heat surged in a modest amber glow that painted the faces of the onlookers with a gentle hue. Laughter rose, tentative at first, then steadier, as the villagers realized the blaze was not a sorcery, but a simple mistiming of wind and tinder. The brothers exchanged a relieved smile, the tension in their shoulders easing as the fire's heat brushed their fingertips. The moment carried a quiet irony. The very element they had feared, wind, becoming the catalyst for their comfort. Soon the pit was alight, the manner of smoke rising in thin, curling ribbons that drifted above the low roofs, while the surrounding snow began to melt in tiny rivulets that glistened like glass beads. Villagers gathered around the hearth, pulling woven blankets over their laps, the wool soft against chilled skin, and sharing bowls of thin broth that steamed in the newfound warmth. The conversation settled into a low murmur, stories of harvests past and jokes about the stubborn manure that had almost denied them a night of sleep. Children traced patterns in the soot with sticks, their fingers leaving delicate marks that soon faded under the steady glow. The fire's steady pulse matched the slow beat of the village's heart, each crackle a reminder of shared endurance and simple ingenuity. In that calm, the night seemed longer but less harsh, the cold outside merely a backdrop to human companionship. When the fire dwindled to glowing embers, the villagers lingered, eyes half closed, listening to the faint sigh of the wind as it brushed the empty fields beyond the stone wall. The brothers, now seated on a rough wooden bench, reflected on the thin line between hope and hardship, noting how a modest misstep had almost turned routine into fear. Their thoughts drifted to the next frost, the next gathering of manure, and the quiet confidence that the same hands that once failed could learn anew. The night ended with a soft hush, the last ember fading like a distant star, leaving behind a faint warmth that clung to the stone and to memory. In the stillness, the village seemed to inhale a collective breath, appreciating the ordinary miracle of heat born from Earth's own remnants. The lesson settled gently, human imperfection, when met with patient observation, can kindle comfort even in the deepest cold. In the waning light of a -20 degrees F night, the villagers gathered around the communal pit, the air thick with the sour scent of dried manure, piled like weather-worn bricks, hands stiff from cold lifted bundles, while eyes lingered on the barren horizon, each breath forming a fleeting cloud that vanished as quickly as hope. A muted murmur rose from the crowd, a quiet pledge to coax warmth from the stubborn earth, while a lone blacksmith raised a flint, its surface dulled by years of use. The stone struck, sending a brief flash that flickered like a distant star, momentarily illuminating the blurred faces of those who watched. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, awaiting the reluctant fire that might finally defy the frost. The spark caught the dry tinder with a soft hiss, and a thin orange tongue licked the edges of the manure, coaxing a steady glow that grew with hesitant confidence. Heat radiated outward, a gentle pressure against chilled cheeks, and the villagers leaned in, feeling the first true relief after hours of numbness. Yet the flames, unbidden, began to leap higher, their crackle louder than the wind's moan, casting elongated shadows that danced across rough stone walls. The scent of burning hay mingled with the acrid perfume of ash, filling the night with a sharp, invigorating bite. Anxiety edged the crowd as the fire threatened to spill beyond its makeshift bounds, turning a moment of salvation into a looming peril. Amid the sudden surge, a young maid slipped a damp cloth over her mouth, the fabric dampened by tears of both cold and surprise, while an elderly farmer chuckled low, his voice a dry rustle like parchment, remarking on the irony of needing fire from what was once merely waste. The faces of the onlookers remained hidden in the wavering glow, their features softened by the flickering light, as if the very heat blurred their identities. Children darted back and forth, their bare feet pattering on frozen stone, their laughter a fragile thread woven through the crackle of the blaze. The village elder, eyes narrowed but unseen, gestured with a wooden staff toward the water barrels, silently directing a measured dousing that steadied the inferno. In that exchange of frantic gestures and quiet humor, the fire's fury was tempered not by force, but by collective restraint, turning potential disaster into a shared, almost theatrical act. Gradually, the flames settled into a warm, amber circle, their edges restrained by the careful addition of damp earth and the steady breaths of those who tended them. The air grew richer, the chill receding like a tide pulled back, while the glow painted the faces of the villagers in soft, amber tones that hinted at relief rather than triumph. Hands that had trembled now moved with deliberate calm, arranging stones to form a low wall, each stone clicking into place with a muted thud that resonated like a quiet heartbeat. The scent shifted to a comforting nuttiness, the lingering smoke curling upward, disappearing into the night sky that held no stars but a faint, hopeful hue. Around the fire, the community settled into a hushed rhythm, sharing broth in cracked clay bowls, the steam rising as a silent testament to perseverance. When the fire finally dimmed to a low ember, the village lay in a tranquil hush. The night's harshness softened into a memory, brushed aside by the warmth of shared effort. Slowly, the villagers rose, their coats brushing the frozen ground, each footstep a measured imprint in the powdery snow that had once threatened to immobilize them. A quiet contemplation settled over the settlement as the youngest child traced a fingertip along the soot-blackened wall, marveling at the mark of human ingenuity against nature's chill. The elder, his silhouette scarcely discernible in the fading glow, stared at the embers with a gaze that seemed to measure the fleeting balance between necessity and excess. In the lingering silence, the village understood, without fanfare, that the modest fire, born of dried manure and humble resolve, held a quiet lesson about the steady flame of cooperation that endures long after the night has passed. The night in Frosthalow settled at a relentless degrees F, and the village huts exhaled thin plumes of breath that curled like smoke over frozen stone. Families huddled around ash-black hearths, their fingers numb as they turned cracked wooden doors to keep the wind at bay. Above the roofs, piles of dried manure, yellowed by summer sun and stacked like quiet barns, waited in the shadows of the waning moon. Old women whispered of a legend that the earth's waste could hold hidden warmth, but their voices were muffled by the crackling of cold wind through shutters. In this stillness, the villagers sensed an unspoken question. Could the scent of hay and dung become a candle against the frost? The first attempt to coax fire from the manure sparked a thin, sputtering flame that hissed and died, sending a puff of acrid smoke into the cabin's dim interior. Children flinched as the bitter heat brushed their cheeks, while the blacksmith's apprentice slammed his iron pan against the stone, trying to shield the ember from the draft. Each failed ignition heightened the ache in knuckles, and the bite of cold that seemed to seep through woolen cuffs. The villagers gathered around a low stone table, their breath clouding the air, and argued in low tones about how to stoke the stubborn bundle without setting the thatch aflame. The tension hung like frost on a window pane, thin and unyielding, as the night deepened beyond the reach of any lantern. At last, a stray spark slipped from a discarded piece of tinder, landing on a dry edge of the manure, and blooming into a reluctant glow that painted the walls with amber shadows. The unexpected warmth raised eyebrows and a weary smile as the fire steadied, its orange tongues licking the pile with a quiet confidence. Ironically, the very waste that had been shunned as refuse now whispered comfort, its heat spreading like a secret shared among old stones. Mothers lifted their hands, feeling the gentle rise of temperature against chilled skin, and the blacksmith's hammer fell softer, as if the metal sensed the new calm. Laughter, thin as distant wind, slipped through the hut, acknowledging the absurdity that salvation could rise from what the fields had discarded. With the ember secure, the villagers arranged the manure in a low circular pit, layering straw and stone to channel the heat toward the hearth without threatening the thatch. They tended the blaze with measured breaths, adding dried splints at intervals, each addition a deliberate whisper against the night. The cabin's interior softened, the air turning from icy clarity to a steady, comforting warmth that coaxed wool blankets to loosen. In the glow, faces appeared relaxed, eyes half closed, the earlier urgency replaced by a patient rhythm of stirring pots and mending tools. Winter's grip loosened, and the village settled into a gentle routine, the fire's steady pulse matching the slow beat of heartbeats around it. When spring's thaw finally brushed the fields, the villagers remembered the night when dried manure became a quiet beacon against relentless cold. Elders recounted the episode to children, not as triumph, but as a reminder of how ordinary remnants can hold unexpected power when handled with care. The hearthstone bore faint char marks, a subtle chronicle of a community that learned to listen to the earth's humble offerings. Each winter thereafter, a small pile of the former waste was set aside, a ritual born of that frigid night, carried out with the same unhurried reverence. In the soft rustle of wool and the sigh of fire, Frosthlow kept the memory alive, a modest lesson that perseverance turns even the most profane into gentle salvation.